Good morning. I'm pleased to call this hearing to order. Before we take up the business of the day, Senator Capito and I and our colleagues have just listened to a live virtual address by the President of the Ukraine, President Zelensky, and we're shown a video of this is just utter carnage that's taking place in that country. I think I'd like to, I don't know that I've ever done this, I think I'd like to start with a moment of silence and prayer. Amen. Thank you. Well, it's not a good morning in some places around the world as we watch the carnage that's taking place in the Ukraine. But it's a good morning here in this hearing room, and it's actually a beautiful day. I go back and forth to Delaware on the train. Today I had to get up very early, and we drove over and came down Route 301 through Delaware and Maryland. And what a glorious, glorious day across the Chesapeake Bay. And so for that perspective, it's a glorious morning. And we're anxious to hear from all of you. We're here to discuss an important topic, one that Senator Capito and I care a great deal about, along with our colleagues. And to those who may not be familiar, this is one of the primary programs in our country for financing water infrastructure projects. And specifically, this program funds the construction of wastewater treatment facilities. To better inform our conversation, we have an excellent panel of witnesses joining us today in person. It's great to see you all. Ms. Dreyfus-Wells, Mr. Sigmund, Mr. Ramseur, and Ms. Watson. Welcome to the Environment and Public Works Committee. This is a committee that gets things done. We're a committee that works together. And we're proud to be a part of this committee and have the opportunity to lead with Senator Capito. Before we dive into the topic of our hearing, I think it's important to recall how we got here. And I'm not talking about the train or a car or an airplane, but as you may recall, last year this committee worked in an overwhelmingly bipartisan way to draft the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act, legislation that included historic investments in our state revolving funds. That bill passed out of this committee unanimously, and later out of the full Senate by a vote of 89-2. And those of us on this committee are no strangers to the fact that most legislation doesn't receive votes of 89-2 in the United States Senate. Our water infrastructure bill was an important exception. This bill, along with our committee's historic bipartisan highway legislation, served as the cornerstone of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which President Biden signed into law right in front of us, right beside us almost, last November, a special day for all of us. A couple of kids from West Virginia celebrating the day, the president from Delaware. Well, thanks in large part to our committee's efforts, the Environmental Protection Agency is in the process of distributing some $55 billion to improve drinking water and wastewater systems in communities across this country. This is the single largest investment in water infrastructure in our nation's history. As President Biden likes to say, this is a big deal. It's a big deal. During a consideration of our drinking water and wastewater bill in the Senate last year, Senator Capito and I made a commitment to a couple of senators, a couple of our colleagues, Senators Kelly and Senator Capito, that we would hold a hearing examining the formula for the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. Today's hearing is our opportunity to begin to better understand what changes, if any, should be made to improve the distribution of funds under this program. Specifically, I look forward to a robust discussion on the current formula that EPA uses to distribute funding to states and to territories, and how that formula may be improved to strengthen equity and address unmet needs. For me, investing in clean water is personal. As Senator Capito knows, my sister and I were born in Beckley, West Virginia, a coal mining town in the southern part of the state. For the first 6 years of my life, and my sister's life, in the mountain state. We lived alongside a stream outside of Beckley, a stream called Beaver Creek. And sometimes my sister Sheila and I, along with other kids in our small community, would play in the banks of the creek and try to catch small fish from it and an occasional frog. But we were never allowed to eat the fish or the frogs that we caught there. In part, that was because the nearby septic tanks were not well maintained. And as a result, sometimes raw sewage and other pollution would seep into the creek. At the time, our situation was not too different from many other small communities across that state, the mountain state, and across the country. Several years later, after graduating from the Ohio State University, I deployed with my squadron to Southeast Asia as a naval flight officer. 1969, shortly after I arrived there, I learned that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, had caught on fire. And this fire, heard around the world, served as a wake-up call for our nation to get serious about addressing pollution, particularly water pollution. Congress responded by enacting the Clean Water Act in 1972. In the years that followed, communities across our country applied for grant funding to help build or upgrade wastewater treatment systems. And over time, grant requests greatly exceeded the funding available. During the Reagan administration, a new controversial approach emerged: creation of revolving loan funds administered and managed by each state. I was a congressman then and had an opportunity to vote on that legislation. But after becoming law in 1987, these funds were periodically modified and annually spending bills to meet changing needs and increase demand for resources. In more recent years, however, these programs had languished with the authorization for state revolving loan funds in dire need of updating. That's why, along with our ranking member, Senator Capito, Senator Duckworth, Senator Lummis, Senator Cardin, and Senator Cramen, all members of this committee, joined forces, I like that word, joined forces, to address this need in the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. There's an acronym for that act that I have never used. It's the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act. Our legislation reauthorized and increased the funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund for the first time, and get this, in nearly 35 years. And with the recent passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have an opportunity to build on this work and to further improve the way we invest in our nation's infrastructure. That includes having more in-depth conversations about the Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula and what we might consider updating in the program. What could certainly be done to, more could certainly be done to adapt the formula for changes in climate, changes in population, and changes in simply because we're living in the infrastructure age. So as I said at the outset, let's use this hearing today to gain a deeper understanding of all the many factors, at least most of the many factors, in the current Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula. Let's take this time to examine and discuss opportunities for making that distribution more equitable as we go forward. And with that, I'm delighted to turn over the microphone to my wing woman, our senior Republican, and just a great partner on this issue and a lot of others, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and great statement. And I can't start without the images and the video that we saw and the powerful statements by President Zelensky has, I think, probably drained every American. I mean, just thinking of the pain. And so we're pretty united in our thoughts and certainly in our prayers. So thank you for that moment of silence. I appreciate that. I want to thank you, Chairman, for calling the hearing, but I want to thank all of you, the witnesses, for being with us today, and I look forward to your remarks. The Chairman summarized this, but I do think this committee values hearing your perspective on the challenges facing the nation's wastewater infrastructure, as well as your thoughts on effective solutions to address those challenges through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. We're all here today to discuss that important issue of updating, possibly, the Clean Water SRF fund formula itself, which came into sharp focus during our consideration, as the chair said, of the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act DWEA, that's what it's called, right? Got it. Around this time last
I knew there was an acronym there somewhere.
on that bill's way to enactment of the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, which I keep calling the BIF. So we're all into our acronyms. As we committed at that time to colleagues interested in this issue, we should consider updating the formula for the Clean Water SRF in the same bipartisan and thoughtful approach that we undertook in advancing DWEA to an 89-2 vote on the Senate floor. I believe ensuring reliable, modern water infrastructure is a fundamental responsibility of government. Water is not a red or blue issue. It's not a big city or small town problem. It's everybody, in everybody's best interests. The issues we are addressing today today affect every single American, which is why I'm committed to doing the appropriate due diligence and outreach to ensure we come up with a final product that does not leave anyone behind. Since inception in 1987, when you voted for it, the Clean Water SRF has been an effective tool to provide much-needed federal funding to improve our nation's water and wastewater infrastructure, enjoying broad and consistent bipartisan support at the federal and state levels. Through the Clean Water SRF, EPA provides funding to states, which then issue loans to communities to facilitate infrastructure improvement projects. And we know through much testimony and certainly talking to our local government officials and folks who run these systems, many of them are very, very old and antiquated. Interest on these loans then revolve, providing additional funding for future projects and a greater investment return for taxpayer dollars. This program has been cost-effective and well-utilized, certainly in our state, with EPA leveraging $45 billion in federal dollars into more than $145 billion in assistance to local communities to improve their wastewater treatment systems, protect human health, and reduce pollution. It is noteworthy to mention that the reason that the SRF's success has been the flexibility given to it in the state revolving fund. Recently, EPA released a SRF memo that takes away or potentially could take away some of that flexibility, and I view that, as I have other memos by this administration, as an overreach. In April of 2021, Senators Rubio and Scott offered an amendment to the Drinking Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Act, which would have changed the formula deployed for 34 years to allocate state revolving loan funding. As I mentioned, Chairman Carper and I pledged to Senator Rubio and Scott that we would, and I know this is an issue for Senator Colley as well, that we would continue to work with them on this issue, which spurred today's hearing. I respectfully disagreed with the approach of their amendment, which was ultimately defeated, and would have converted the Clean Water SRF to a wholly population-based formula. This ignores the crucial issue of need, which was baked into the original formula, and for states like Delaware and West Virginia, could have had some negative effects. Need varies across and within the states based on population growth or reduction, the age or condition of existing infrastructure, and the unique public health, environmental challenges, and development needs of impacted communities. It is essential to me that rural communities are treated appropriately and that unique challenges in infrastructure deployment are accommodated in any revised Clean Water SRF formula. And this committee and the Congress explicitly acknowledge that need must be assessed and documented in the Clean Water SRF. Section 50220, I know you knew that, you knew what section it was, of the IIJA, carried over directly from DWEA, instructs the EPA within 2 years to conduct a clean watersheds needs assessment or survey along the lines of what the agency already does for the Drinking Water SRF. This information will be essential to any revision of the formula. I acknowledge that formula allocations set back in 1987 may not adequately address today's needs and demographic shifts. But given the complexity of the issues, we have our work cut out for us. Major changes to the Clean Water SRF should not be rushed and must be the product of a deliberative process here in Congress that allows impacted stakeholders the opportunity to provide the input needed to ensure that any legislative action works for all states and types of communities. It's one thing to draft a law here on Capitol Hill, but quite another to implement it back home. That is why this hearing with this panel of experts and the work that will follow is so very important. I remain committed to working on these clean water issues that are so important to me, the citizens of my state of West Virginia, and my fellow committee members. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Senator Capito, thank you for a wonderful opening statement. Now I get to introduce our witnesses. And first, Jonathan Ramseur. Is that a French name? German, okay. A specialist in environmental policy from the Congressional Research Service. And I understand you've worked there for over 16 years. In his role, Mr. Ramseur covers wastewater infrastructure funding issues, and we're fortunate today to learn from his expertise in this area. Mr. Ramseur, please proceed to give your statement now, and we look forward to receiving it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. My name is Jonathan Ramseur, and I'm a specialist in environmental policy at the Congressional Research Service. I would like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify today on behalf of CRS. I have been asked by the committee to discuss the Clean Water Act's allotment formula for distributing funds under the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program. I will summarize my written testimony with these brief remarks. In 1987, amendments to the Clean Water Act established the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program, otherwise known as the SRF program. For the past 30 years, the SRF program has been the key federal funding program for wastewater infrastructure projects throughout the country. Each state in Puerto Rico administers its own SRF program. U.S. territories and Indian tribes receive grants directly from EPA rather than administering their own program. The SRF programs provide financial assistance to a range of recipients supporting a variety of projects and activities, including construction of wastewater treatment facilities, stormwater systems, among others. The 1987 Clean Water Act amendments included SRF funding allocation percentages for each state and U.S. territory. Based on formulas in the House and Senate bills that evolved into the 1987 amendments, Congress likely based the state allotments on some combination of wastewater infrastructure needs and population, among other factors. However, the legislative history does not explicitly describe these factors or how they are weighted in the allotments. These allotments, which provide a minimum share of 0.5% to each state, have effectively been in place since the program's establishment. Since 1987, in coordination with the states, EPA has produced 7 infrastructure needs surveys. EPA published its most recent survey in 2016. In addition, the Census Bureau has prepared 4 census reports. None of this more recent information is reflected in the current statutory funding allocation. The Water Resources Reform and Development Act of 2014 directed EPA to report to Congress whether the current allotment adequately addresses water quality needs. EPA published this report in 2016. Based on the difference between the current allotments and the revised needs surveys and state population estimates, EPA concluded that most states do not currently receive appropriated funds in proportion to their infrastructure needs estimates or population. For example, EPA found that the current formula is inadequate for 39 states and territories compared with the most recent needs survey. The SRF program is the primary federal assistance program for wastewater infrastructure, and the allotment formula has been one of the more debated issues during considerations of Clean Water Act authorization legislation. Considerations of states' potential allotment decreases or increases bear heavily on the discussion of policy choices reflected in alternative formulations. If Congress chooses to deliberate on amendments to the SRF program allotment to the states, policymakers would have a range of options, including those provided in EPA's 2016 report. These options consist of different combinations of needs, population, and other factors. For example, policymakers could include limitations similar to EPA's options, namely the constraints on the magnitude of decreases or increases a state would face under a revised formula. In addition, Congress may look to the allocation formula of other water infrastructure programs, such as the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program. Under this program, EPA allots funding to the states based on the results of the most recent needs survey for drinking water, which the Safe Drinking Water Act requires EPA to prepare every 4 years. This concludes my brief remarks. Thank you again for the invitation to appear today, and I will be pleased to address any questions you may have.
Mr. Ramseur, thank you very, very much for that statement. And Mr. Segman, tell us where you're from. Where do you live now?
I live in Green Bay, Wisconsin.
And I understand they have we signed a quarterback.
We did.
And
It'll be about 30 years of Hall of Fame quarterbacks leading Wisconsin. Green Bay.
that's pretty amazing.
It's pretty amazing.
One of the members of my staff back in Dallas loves Aaron Rodgers. I mean, he worships the guy, watches him play all over the country. So I'll tell him you were before us, and I presume, like most folks in Green Bay and Wisconsin, share his passion.
Yes.
In any event, aside from that, I'm not going to get into your bio very much, but you got a great experience and very appropriate for today's hearing. We're anxious to hear from you. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear today. My name is Tom Sigmund. I am the Executive Director at New Water, the brand of the Green Bay Metropolitan Sewerage District in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We are a regional clean water utility providing wholesale conveyance and treatment services to 238,000 people across 15 municipalities in northeast Wisconsin with 101 employees and an annual budget of $45 million. I also serve as the Vice President of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, for whom I appear before you today. For over 50 years, NACWA has represented public wastewater and stormwater agencies nationwide. Our network of 330 public agency members are on the front lines of public health and environmental protection. The precursor to the current Clean Water State Revolving Fund was the Construction Grants Program established in the 1970s to help communities fund capital investments to comply with the Clean Water Act. After considerable debate in the 1980s, Congress phased out this grant program and created the Clean Water SRF to provide low-cost financing. It has since become the federal government's main tool to support local communities in water infrastructure investment. Congress provides appropriations to EPA to capitalize revolving funds administered by the states, and those states provide a 20% match. The states then issue loans to publicly owned treatment works. As the POTWs assume the loans, build the infrastructure, and repay the loans, the funds revolve, grow, and support other communities and additional projects. Over time, Congress has updated the Clean Water SRF, such as by granting flexibility to the states to provide additional subsidization. I cannot overstate how much of a lifeline the Clean Water SRF has been for clean water utilities across this country, especially in Wisconsin. For many utilities, this is their only access to affordable financing. New Water has utilized these programs since they were first introduced. Converted to 2021 dollars, New Water has invested $1.2 billion in capital facilities over the past 45 years, utilizing $1 billion of loans and grants. Almost 50% of New Water's 2022 annual budget is devoted to capital projects, underscoring how capital-intensive our work is. This discussion underscores how the infusion of capitalization grants is critically important for Clean Water SRF sustainability. With funding to each state dependent on the allotment formula, it warrants continued attention. According to a review by EPA, as we just heard, it is not known how the weighting and the factors were selected and how they were used to establish the formula. It is likely they were centered on population, capital needs, a hold harmless provision, as well as we heard a minimum allotment. Stakeholders can likely agree that the allocation formula is dated and warrants new consideration and clarity. Since the 1980s, our nation's population has shifted, and so have clean water infrastructure cost, assets, and investment needs. Population increases can lead to new investment needs, but lower population growth does not necessarily lead to reduced demands. Policymakers have recognized the need to review the formula for well over a decade. Congress has directed EPA and GAO to perform audits of the formula and suggest policy options. Among the solutions proposed to reform the allocation, a few themes emerge. It is important to consider clean water needs, including the types of investments and how they should be weighted in the allocation. Population is an important consideration, but should not be the sole factor. NACWA urges no state see a reduction in funds. Clean water investment demands remain high and new challenges continue to emerge. The Clean Water Act envisioned a strong federal-state partnership, and funding and financing are an important part of that partnership. The allocation process should also consider the historic per capita investment each state has made in funding wastewater projects, as these assets must eventually be replaced. EPA and the states must undertake a comprehensive needs survey. NACWA thanks this Congress for recognizing that an updated survey is needed by authorizing $5 million in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We were relieved to see Congress direct $1.5 million for this survey last week in the omnibus. Finally, we encourage an update to the formula that represents an updated needs survey and an approach that can adapt more steadily to future changes. These updates will take time, but a smooth, transparent, and apolitical process is important. NACWA and I appreciate the opportunity to share our views. I am proud of the work public clean water agencies have accomplished. Our nation's complex water quality challenges and investment needs have grown. Additional federal resources are critical to ensure utilities are prepared to meet the challenges of today and tomorrow, starting with the bipartisan infrastructure law, which we stand ready to implement. And when it's time, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Sigmund, thank you so much. In reading your bio, do people call you Miss Dreyfus Wells? Is that it? Dreyfus Wells? Oh, okay. I noted that you graduated summa cum laude from Ohio State University. I also graduated from Ohio State University, not summa cum laude. I use this joke many times at commencements, but I won't tell you whose joke it really is. But I've addressed many graduating classes and said, some of you are graduating summa cum laude today, some of you are graduating magna cum laude, some of you are graduating cum laude, and some of you are graduating today by the grace of the good laude. And I once used that at the graduation ceremony then at Delaware State University, which is the #3 HBCU in the country. And it turned out the guy who was the keynote address followed me, and it was his joke. I won't soon forget that, and frankly, neither will he. But let me see here. Go back to my script.
You're doing well.
The Chief Executive Officer of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District in Cleveland. Where do you actually live?
I live in Shaker Heights.
Shaker Heights. Yeah. Kyle, we look forward to hearing from you today. Please proceed. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Thank you for inviting us to testify this morning about the importance of adequately funding clean water infrastructure across the country with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. As the Senator said, I'm Kyle Dreyfus Wells, CEO of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District in Cleveland. I'm also a NACWA board member, and I am pleased to join my colleague, Tom Sigmund, here today. So the sewer district is among the largest wastewater treatment and stormwater management utilities in Ohio. We serve the city of Cleveland and 61 communities across 355 square miles of the Lake Erie watershed. Our 750 employees manage 3 wastewater treatment plants, processing 90 billion gallons of flow annually, 475 miles of the regional stormwater system, and 350 miles of large inter-community sewers. Our district serves a broad customer base, including households, our region's industrial base, and 2 of the largest hospital systems in the nation. We do this with a $170 million annual operating budget and an approximately $270 million annual capital program. So this is what it takes to protect public health and water quality of Northeast Ohio. And it is funded by the 1 million people that we serve. So while we're here today to talk about the SRF, I have found in conversations about clean water that it centers on 3 factors: rates, affordability, and ensuring access of all customers to clean, reliable sewer service. The SRF in Ohio is essential to us doing that as we rely on it to finance our critical work and to control the rates that our customers pay. The modern-day environmental movement was born in Cleveland, starting with a spark that ignited the Cuyahoga River for the 13th time in 1969. That fire unleashed a relentless effort to care for the water of our region and gave way to the Clean Water Act, and more locally for us, the creation of the sewer district in 1972. For the first 20 years of our work, we received nearly $600 million in federal construction grants, and with this, we invested in reducing the amount of combined sewage to Lake Erie and making critical improvements to the region's wastewater collection system and treatment facilities. By the early 90s, federal construction grants were significantly reduced, but the need for continued clean water capital investments remained. So we looked to our ratepayers. For 30 years, the ratepayers have paid for nearly all of our clean water work through sustained rate increases. Every year, the people of Northeast Ohio, including in Cleveland, where 30% live below the federal poverty line, have paid for clean water. Today, our customers pay an average of $70 per month. While none of us who live in Northeast Ohio like paying these high rates, we do pay these high rates and have done so for many years because they are necessary to do this work. So our customers have continued to have confidence in us, and we have continued to have the respect for them to focus on controlling their rates through reliance on the SRF and cost containment across our organization and through our project management. Today, I'm proud to say that the water quality improvements in our community underscore Cleveland's rebirth, but more work and more investment is needed. Recently, we accepted SRF funding for our Shoreline storage tunnel, a $200 million effort under Project Clean Lake, our multi-billion-dollar federally mandated program to further reduce combined sewage to Lake Erie. With SRF funding, we financed the project using very favorable borrowing terms, 40 years at 1.57% interest, and based on our most recent bond refinancing and our credit rating, we estimate 3% if we were to bond finance this for 40 years. So over the length of this loan, this equates to roughly $50 million in savings. Using the SRF, we minimize costs and pass the savings to our customers. We have financed over 100 projects with the SRF, and in a region with aging infrastructure, we plan to invest $1.2 billion over the next 5 years. SRF funding will help us to continue to reduce the financial impact on our customers. So we acknowledge that communities across the country face rising infrastructure expenses, but we cannot forget older communities like Cleveland with aging infrastructure, increased regulatory requirements, poverty, and declining population. The issues in growing and older communities may be different, but the need for SRF funding is the same. Increased SRF funding can meet the needs of all communities across the country, old and new, large and small. So in closing, I hold Northeast Ohio to you as a model for doing clean water infrastructure right. We recognized our problems and have worked hard for the last 50 years to address them. The ability of utilities like mine to access SRF financing makes it possible for us to control costs and to protect clean water for all of our customers. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Dreyfus, well, thank you for your statement. It's great to meet you, and thank you for coming today and for the work you do.
Thank you.
And our batting cleanup of our panel of 4 is Laura Watson, Director of the State of Washington, Washington State Department of Ecology. Prior to serving in this position, Director Watson spent over 20 years in the State Attorney General's office, working to protect the environment. Ms. Watson, we thank you for joining us and ask you to go ahead and proceed with your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee.
My name is Laura Watson, as the senator said, and I'm the director of the Washington State Department of Ecology. I also chair the Water Committee for the Environmental Council of the States, also known as ECOS. It's an honor to be here today to be testifying on behalf of ECOS. ECOS was formed in 1993 to bring states and territories together across state boundaries and across party lines, to strengthen the work of our environmental agencies to protect the environment and to protect public health. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a critical financial assistance tool for environmental agencies to protect water quality in our communities through investments in clean water infrastructure. The federal investments in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act mark an unprecedented opportunity to repair and expand essential infrastructure that will strengthen security and well-being for our communities. This is one of the most exciting times in history to be able to be leading this work and to be collaborating with our state and federal partners to tackle some of our nation's biggest challenges. With renewed investment, now is also the right time, we believe, to consider the Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula and assess if it's still working as it was intended when it was written 35 years ago. ECOS supports a robust, a balanced, a thorough, and a thoughtful consideration of the allotment formula, along with the various criteria that could be used to modernize it. We are aware that changes to the formula could likely result in some states seeing increases and other states seeing decreases in their funding levels. Due to this, ECOS is not in a position to recommend specific changes to the formula at this time, but we do support a thorough review to understand if the formula is actually meeting the needs of each state and our residents. We further request that Congress work with EPA and state organizations like ECOS in this process. As Congress undertakes the process to review the formula, there are several aspects that ECOS would recommend you consider. First, the definition of need should account for the actual needs and the unique needs of states. Infrastructure needs have changed significantly since the formula was first implemented. And many have already mentioned that in some areas we have population shifts that have resulted in more states experiencing growth and a greater need for infrastructure. On the flip side, we have states who have had population decreases, which means there are fewer resources, fewer ratepayers to tackle aging infrastructure. In 2016, EPA reevaluated what constitutes need in communities to assess needs beyond traditional wastewater infrastructure. And we support that. For example, in my state, stormwater treatment to reduce pollution from existing development is critical to protecting the Puget Sound estuary. Like Washington, of course, each state has its own unique clean water priorities that need to be addressed, and we support EPA's efforts to ensure that these are captured through the needs survey. Second, the allotment formula should be based on recent and robust data. The last Clean Watershed Needs Survey from EPA was published in 2016. The data was from 2012, and now we have a new survey underway. We hope that the data that we're collecting now will be able to be analyzed, summarized, and published by EPA in 2023, so we've got recent data that will be of assistance in looking at the formula. Third, we recommend reevaluating other criteria after completion of the survey. For example, and again, you've heard this a lot, a formula that's based just on population may not reflect all of the needs within a state, and if you have high-quality needs data available, may not be necessary. Fourth, ECOS recommends reviewing how environmental justice is considered in the formula. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund has long focused on providing guidance in this area to support disadvantaged communities. The bill, the Infrastructure Act, strengthens this commitment by assigning certain percentages to these disadvantaged communities as grants and forgivable loans, and ensuring that the allotment formula incorporates these commitments could address longstanding environmental justice issues. There are a few other recommendations contained in my written testimony, but in the interest of time, I will wrap it up there. Again, I want to thank you on behalf of Washington State and my peers and all of the other states, territories, and Washington, D.C. We very, very much appreciate your work your ongoing investments, and your work to take a fresh look at the allotment formula. Thank you.
Ms. Watson, thank you. I would just say to our colleagues who are arriving in, all of us serve on a lot of committees. And as it turns out, there's a bunch of hearings going on this morning. And I'm going to be in and out, my suspicion, I guess, the ranking member, Senator Capito, may be in and out, but we'll keep things moving. But we've been joined by senators from as far away as Arizona, from as close by as Maryland, and from as far away as Alaska, and fairly far away from Arkansas. So we're happy that you're all here. And I just want to say to our staffs, both on the majority side and minority side, you pulled together an all-star lineup here, and our staffs were grateful to all of you. We're going to move to some questions now. I'm going to kick it off with Mr. Ramseur. To start with you. Your written testimony outlines the history and the evolution of the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And while we know that the formula has not been updated, I believe, since 1987, Congress has made a number of tweaks through the appropriations process to adjust the formula to account for additional issues such as tribal needs and maybe needs up in Alaska for some of the folks that Senator Sullivan represents. I'm going to ask Ms. Ramseur if you'd just elaborate for us on some of the changes that Congress has made through the appropriations process, and give us some idea why you think Congress made those changes, what led Congress to make them. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Well, first off, the territories initially had 0.25% in aggregate allocation under the Clean Water Act. In recent appropriations acts for, I think, for the past 10 years or so, that aggregate amount has been increased to 1.5%. And so that's a change that Congress has made through appropriations acts. As well, there's a new provision, relatively new provision in the Clean Water Act devoting up to 2% for Indian tribes, and EPA has in recent years gone to that 2%. So those are the changes that have been made in that respect.
Second half of the question is, what do you think led the Congress to make those changes?
Well, I'd have to dig a little bit deeper and come back to you on that one.
Anybody else have a thought on that second half of my question? Anybody? No?
A stumper.
Like the record shows, the first time I've ever stumped any panel, any of my questions. All right, we'll come back to that later on. My second question, again, this would be to Mr. Sigmund. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provides unprecedented levels of supplemental funding for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. This kind of historic investment, coupled with the ability to distribute a significant amount of money that fund, a significant amount of the funding that in the form of grants or in the form of loan forgiveness. And it will provide all states and territories with more resources for water infrastructure than they have ever had before, I believe. As states begin to implement this historic level of funding, Congress needs to start thinking about how to rebalance the formula going forward. An important first step in balancing the formula is to look at gaps in the funding distribution. Here's my question. Are there gaps in the current state revolving fund program that need to be addressed to help EPA provide a more equitable distribution of those funds to the states, the tribes, and the territories?
Well, my experience, my detailed experience is through the state of Wisconsin, their Clean Water Fund. And I have said in the past that the Clean Water Fund in the state of Wisconsin is one of the best administered funds that I've ever come across. And when I was a consultant, I saw many across the state. It is encouraging utilities to stay in compliance and to get ahead of things. And so that's a well-run program. In general, I think what we're seeing with this current bipartisan infrastructure law is more money coming into states for Clean Water Fund, and it's bringing it closer to a level as to what we need. So the biggest gap has been, and hopefully can be rectified in the future, is just the needs greatly exceed the funding that comes from the federal government. We need to continue that. Have I answered your question?
I think so. A follow-up. You mentioned that the revolving fund in Wisconsin may be the best around. Why is it? How has it been able to achieve that kind of recognition?
The process.
I like to
that-
say, find out what works, do more of that, so maybe we can learn something from the Badgers.
Process that the state of Wisconsin uses, it requires utilities through the compliance maintenance program. We have to submit a scorecard for our utility every year to the state of Wisconsin, looking back at our compliance, looking at our rated capacity of our facilities and seeing how we stand, as well as said, environmental compliance. So the state requires us to be proactive. And when we do that, we're seeing things well in advance of when they need to be implemented, capital projects. We then can, in a more thoughtful manner, plan those capital projects, work with our customers to start to increase the rates if we need to fund them. And then also, we work with the state of Wisconsin, the Clean Water Fund, to get our project into their priority system so that they can rank it and determine what level of priority it is. And if a utility needs some type of supplemental funding outside of just a straight loan, additional subsidy. And so I think the state of Wisconsin has done a great job of working to keep us on task so that utilities do not fall into disrepair and then things become an emergency.
All right. Thank you for that. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield to Senator from Arkansas, Senator Bozeman, to do his questions.
Thank you, Senator Capito, very much. And I want to thank you and Chairman Carper for having this so very important. In fact, I think one of the hallmarks of this committee is that the hearings that we have greatly impact the problems that people have and on such a number of important issues. The Clean Water Revolving Fund formula is so very important to the state of Arkansas. Through 2020, Arkansas has leveraged more than $325 million in federal funds to support over 1,300 projects with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program. Of those projects, 74% were to communities with a population of less than 10,000 people. Access to safe and reliable water is critical for all Americans, and this initiative makes the process easier, more affordable for states to meet their unmet water infrastructure needs. Mr. Sigmund, in your testimony, you commented that population should be considered in an updated allocation formula, but it should not be the only factor. Can you speak more about why you don't believe a population-only approach is the right strategy to allocating SRF dollars?
Yes, certainly greater population leads to greater flows coming into treatment facilities, conveyance facilities, so it should be a factor. But there is such a significant investment in assets, and these assets at wastewater, whether it be large conveyance facilities or treatment facilities, tend to be long-lived assets that are quite expensive. And I think that consideration needs to be, what are we going to do when those assets need to be replaced? Because that can be, the federal government helped us put them in, and we need help replacing them or doing significant repair. We do take care of the assets. Operation and maintenance is fully within our customers' our annual budgets. I think also a factor that needs to be considered and is different for every state is what are the environmental regulations, the environmental conditions that what levels of treatment do utilities need to do to meet the water quality standards of the body? And they are different across the country.
No, and that's so important. The EPA is ratcheted up, rightfully so in some cases, maybe not so in other cases. And again, that's just a tremendous expense that falls in an effort to make our water as clean as possible. Community wastewater systems, both publicly and privately owned, are essential to the physical and economic health being of rural Arkansas. However, rural communities oftentimes run into additional problems such as lacking technical expertise and the funds to apply for multiple state or federal assistance programs. As a rural state with low, medium household income compared to states with higher populations, we have less people but a greater need. In your opinion, how can we further help communities with smaller ratepayer base get a fair chance at securing state and federal assistance? Mr. Sigmund.
The Clean Water Fund loan process is a challenging process. When we do a loan, our staff is typically preparing a 3+ inch binder of supporting material that is needed by the state of Wisconsin in order to secure the loan. Our staff has done this over the years. We're fairly good at it, if you can ever get really good at it. And it is a significant burden for a utility that has a smaller staff to be able to do that. And we understand the state needs to get the information it needs to be able to secure its loans, but we certainly look forward to trying to simplify the process because it is burdensome. Now, one of the things that has been talked about in our clean water sector is the possibility of a utility such as mine that has some expertise in doing that be able to assist smaller communities. That has not happened yet, but it is a possibility. I think with this bipartisan infrastructure law, you have allocated some money to both EPA and the states to provide training and assistance. One of the things that EPA, in a call that I was on, acknowledged that they need more people to apply for these loans than currently apply for the loans. And so we're going to have to figure out how we can overcome that hurdle of the challenge of putting those together.
Well, my time's run out. Thank you all for being here. I wish I had the time to just extract all of the knowledge out of all of your all's heads, and we do appreciate you taking the time and for this very important hearing. Thank you very much.
Senator Busman, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. Good to see you. All right, Senator Cardin from our neighboring state here, Maryland. Ben.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of our witnesses. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula that was developed, I think, in 1987, no one knows exactly why that formula was created the way it was. We know it's based somewhat on population and need, but we don't know exactly how it was conceived. So it's important that we update it. But as a practical matter, the only way you are going to be able to bring in a new formula is when we put more money into the program, because we don't want to adversely impact any jurisdiction, and just the pragmatic issues. So this is a time to really review the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So let me point out a fact that if you look at our efforts, for example, to clean up the Chesapeake Bay and clean water, the largest single growth source of pollutants going into the Chesapeake Bay is storm runoff. So locally, we have invested a great deal of money and resources into stormwater management. Blue Plains, the largest wastewater treatment facility plant of its kind in the world, has invested a considerable amount of money to deal with stormwater runoff. I was at Back River in Baltimore not too long ago with Senator Van Hollen, and they're investing in stormwater runoff. I mention that because, and we've used creative solutions. Ben Grumbles, who's the Secretary of our Department of Environment, and also, as I understand it, is the President of the Environmental Council of the States, has found creative ways to deal with stormwater runoff. We've used WIFIA funds, we've used whatever we can in order to deal with these issues. But my question is, as we're looking at incorporating need into the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, how does stormwater infrastructure needs come into play as we develop that formula? Because it has not been successful in accessing the Clean Water State Revolving Funds. I've been told that there's actually been an increased allocation to stormwater runoff, but still less than 4% of the allocations under the state revolving funds for clean water. So my question, and whoever wants to volunteer, I'll be glad to let someone go first. How do we ensure that the needs for stormwater management and infrastructure are incorporated under the needs part of the state revolving fund as we look at a new formula?
Well, Senator, everybody's looking at me, so I think I'll go ahead and take first crack at that. Thank you. It's actually an excellent question from Washington State. We are kind of stormwater central as well, so it's a huge focus area for us in terms of pollution reduction. One of the issues with the stormwater funding, and this you can compare this to wastewater utility funding. Wastewater utility, there's a set rate base, and people understand it. And there aren't a lot of stormwater utilities compared to, there are stormwater utilities in states, but not across all regions of the states. And that itself is an impediment to folks applying for those stormwater funds because there's no real rate base in some regions of the country to be able to match the funds that are received. Now, EPA, through the needs survey, is having states look at their stormwater needs. So that's something that states working with local governments should be able to incorporate into the needs survey. But I will use some examples actually from your great state that I'm aware of through Ben Grumbles in terms of other ways in which you can increase states feeling comfortable, local governments feeling comfortable applying for those funds. One is through education and outreach, EPA doing education and outreach to local governments to help governments understand how flexible this funding is. And another area for education and outreach is just to appreciate the co-benefits of stormwater funding. So when you're dealing with stormwater projects, you're not just dealing with the reduction of stormwater, but you're also dealing with toxics reduction, for example, and climate resiliency.
I'm going to want to focus on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund for one moment, because a few years ago we had a hearing before this committee on a similar topic. The mayor of Baltimore was one of our witnesses, and she made a strong impassioned plea in regards to additional tools available to deal with the infrastructure needs for clean water. Baltimore's under a consent order, as many other cities are. The rate structure, the pressure on the ratepayers is enormous in Baltimore, and to increase the rates are extremely difficult and not affordable for a lot of people for their basic utility needs. So looking at this revolving fund is absolutely essential if we're going to be able to make progress on this infrastructure need. And I'll put this for the record. If you could come up with ways in which that is reflected in a needs part of a formula, I would very much appreciate that help.
Senator, if I may, to build on the answer to your question, we operate both a wastewater utility and a stormwater utility at the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. And in response to your question, I think what we're seeing is really the professionalization of stormwater, sort of bringing it up into the same level of structure that we have on the wastewater side, recognizing that stormwater, as you said, is as big a pollutant as the bacteria that we focus on, the E. coli that we focus on the wastewater side. So I think one of the things that would help very much is to sort of demystify green infrastructure, demystify on-site stormwater management, so folks understand that these are structural solutions to manage stormwater as close to its source as possible on each development site with bioretention, et cetera. And having folks understand that there's a way to build these things correctly that is engineered and is maintained and is therefore fundable.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cardin, thank you. Senator Cardin is chairs a subcommittee, major subcommittee on this committee that deals with infrastructure. He's been a great leader on these fronts, brings a lot of knowledge. Believe it or not, used to be state legislator, including speaker. He was the Mr. Speaker for the Maryland General Assembly. Okay, Senator Capito, you're on.
I am going to yield to Senator Sullivan for questions.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to kind of follow up where Senator Bozeman started. I'm concerned about formulas that are too heavily dependent on population. And of course, that's got to be an element. And Mr. Sigmund, you had mentioned that. I want to dig down into a little bit more on the issue of need and then environmental justice, because they're often interrelated. In my state, we have over 30 communities, which includes thousands of households that have no infrastructure, no wastewater infrastructure at all, zero. The people in Alaska refer to the system of honey buckets, which sounds sweet. It's not sweet at all. It's collecting your own human waste and then bringing it out in a bucket and dumping it in a lagoon, okay? America. By the way, Mr. Chairman, these are some of the most patriotic communities in America because they're primarily Alaska Native communities, and Alaska Natives serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. So we have thousands of U.S. citizens, patriotic Americans, who live in third world conditions. That's just not right. When the Flint, Michigan crisis happened, I remember everybody talking about upgrading aging infrastructure. Great, I agree with that. But my point was, well, how about we get to places that have no infrastructure first? So to me, that issue should trump everything. If you're an American and you have to use a honey bucket, sorry, that's just wrong. And every senator should care about that, not just me. But can you, maybe Mr. Sigmund, but others, talk about this issue of need as a priority? And it does, at least in my state, raise issues of racial equity because it's primarily Alaska Native and Indigenous communities that have nothing.
I'll start and let my colleagues fill in. When I was a consulting engineer, I many years ago worked in New Mexico and El Paso, Texas. And in some of those areas where the Native American or some of the areas, water was brought to people in a 55-gallon drum and put on a stand. And you're right, wastewater conveyance was not something that was done automatically. Communities need to look at those, what their community needs. Sometimes when things are spread.
Can I don't want to be rude here, I only have so much time, but shouldn't we, in the formula, prioritize need?
I believe you should.
Okay. Does everybody else agree with that? Yes? You Miss Watson, do you agree with that as well?
Here on behalf of ECOS, we're not prepared to make specific recommendations at this time because states could be winners or losers depending on.
Well, of course, they could be winners and losers. Right now, my constituents are, on this issue, are losers.
Yeah.
And again, I don't even think this is a close call. You talked about racial equity, racial justice. Native people in Alaska use honey buckets in a lot of communities. That's just completely unacceptable. As American citizens, we should all care about that. So do you think we should have some kind of element in the formula that prioritizes that? It's not just Alaska, by the way. I think West Virginia has some of these issues.
Yeah, for sure, that needs are very important for environmental justice communities as well as rural communities and other disadvantaged and smaller communities.
Let me ask it's a different question, but it's also an important one. It's the issue, again, we talk a lot about population. Of course, we have to have some element in the formula about that. But what often gets missed, in my view, is size of the state. I don't have to remind the chairman, I think Alaska is 264 times bigger than Delaware, but who's counting?
We see in Delaware that we punch above our weight.
They do. I mean, the chairman certainly does.
We have 400 chickens for every person in our state.
It's a whole nother issue. But it does obviously create bigger challenges on infrastructure to deploy it when the size of the state is so big, as well as population. What do the panelists think about the issue of, again, in the formula, not just population, but need, we already talked about that, but size of the state? You know, Ohio is a pretty big state. What's your sense on that?
Thank you, Senator. I think the needs survey, if done correctly, and if states are given and localities are given the resources that they need to put that needs survey together, because even the needs survey requires resources, engineering, hydraulic modeling, et cetera, to truly understand the need. Size will be incorporated into that because you'll have to factor in how many miles do I need to lay this sewer pipe? How am I actually going to sewer an area that may be frozen one part of the year and not frozen another part of the year? So these are the questions that localities can answer if they're given the resources to be able to do that. So size will be incorporated into a well-done needs survey.
Okay. Anyone else on the size issue?
Yeah, I think Kyle's talked about with the needs survey, the solution for your state is going to be different than the solution for my state of Wisconsin. And so that's where the needs survey, if it looks at the needs of the community, needs of the state, will come up with what's required, and it will be different for each state.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am concerned that these three potential formulas by the EPA that have been developed are too heavily reliant on population and can make matters worse, at least for states like mine that have these kind of needs and size and challenges.
Senator from Alaska probably recalls when we were debating our water bill on the floor, an amendment was offered to basically change one of the formulas that were under consideration to almost strictly population.
Yeah.
And my recollection is it was defeated something like 86-14. So you're not the only person who feels that population by itself is not sufficient.
Thank you.
Okay, and Senator Kelly's joined us. We have two Navy captains here, a Marine colonel and a general.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet.
And I first want to say thank you to you and Ranking Member Capito for holding this hearing today. I really appreciate it. As you know, this is an important topic to me and to Arizona, and I understand and appreciate the importance of carefully considering any potential changes to the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund formula. Population size and change is an important thing in Arizona. We're a growing population. But to Senator Sullivan's point, we also have similar issues. The Navajo Nation, hundreds of thousands of Native people who often live without infrastructure, without water and sewer, often without electricity either. But I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that the current formula needs to be reformed. And this is the main source of funding for wastewater, stormwater, and groundwater infrastructure improvements. And estimates from EPA and the GAO indicate that fast-growing states with significant infrastructure needs, like Arizona, could see a 2- or 3-fold increase in the amount of funding they receive under this program if the formula were reformed. That's why I've worked with Senator Rubio to raise this issue and propose solutions. Fixing the formula isn't a partisan issue. It's a question of making sure that we're effectively using scarce federal dollars to meet the critical infrastructure needs of communities across the country. So, Mr. Ramseur, thank you for being here. Thank you for all of you for being here today. I want to start with a few basic questions for you. First, the Clean Water SRF was created in 1987. Has the formula determining state allocations ever been updated since then?
Not in the Clean Water Act statute. There have been some small tweaks to it through appropriations acts, and EPA has made some administrative changes, but by and large, it's been the same allotment since 1987.
Thank you. And do we know how Congress determined this allocation formula?
We don't know precisely. Based on the House and Senate bills that were led to the evolution of the 1987 amendments, both of those bills included factors of population and needs and other things. So it's likely that the formula included those, but we don't know explicitly what was included.
Congress did not take enough notes from back then. All right, is there anything in the congressional record from the time which indicates that the formula was designed to consider the water infrastructure needs of a state?
Well, not explicitly, just based on the House and Senate bills, which did include needs as a factor. One might assume that that was included, but we don't know for sure.
Thank you. You note in your testimony that EPA has conducted 16 clean watersheds needs surveys since 1972 to determine water infrastructure needs of a state. Does the allocation formula used to distribute the Clean Water SRF take into account information from these needs surveys?
No.
Does EPA have any legal authority to make adjustments to the Clean Water SRF based on the infrastructure investment need?
Not to my knowledge, no. They have to follow the Clean Water Act provision that directs them to the table, which has the percentages for each state from 1987.
Thank you. As you know, the EPA also manages a companion program to the Clean Water SRF called the Drinking Water SRF. Have the state allocations for the Drinking Water SRF been updated since it was enacted?
Yes, several times.
Several times. And are those allocations updated based on need?
Yes, that's the requirement in the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program. The allocations are based on the most recent needs survey, which generally come out every 4 years.
So the Drinking Water SRF is based on need and has been updated, but the Clean Water SRF is not.
Correct.
All right. So, Mr. Chairman, I have additional questions that I'd like to get to, but let me just say before my time's up, I understand that it's important to have deliberation and debate about funding formula changes, but not acting to change the Clean Water SRF formula is kind of ridiculous. This formula was created 35 years ago. We don't know how the formula was created, and it's not updated to account for evolving needs or changing populations in states. Yeah, we have good examples of other formula funding programs within this committee's jurisdiction that are regularly updated based on the evolving needs of the state. We just pointed out one. But this committee has never acted to try to address this problem. Meanwhile, states like Arizona, which have significant and growing water challenges, are forced to do more with fewer federal resources. And I hope that this hearing is just the first step in a longer process to update the outdated formula. And I appreciate that you and Senator Capito have taken the next step, asking the Government Accountability Office to provide legislative recommendations for potential reforms. And as we see those recommendations, I look forward to working together with you both to continue making progress on this issue.
Great song by Chicago comes to mind, Only the Beginning. Only the Beginning. There we go. All right, Senator Capito.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all, the witnesses. My first several questions that I was going to ask are a bit repetitive of what the testimony that we've heard, and that is that a population-based only, population-only based formula is not satisfactory to meet the demands and to meet different regions of the country, urban, rural, declining populations, growing populations. So I'm not going to re-ask that question. I see shaking heads. So thank you for that. Thank you for confirming that. As I'm thinking about this, I think that the devil's in the details, because there has to be a good definition of what is need. Is a need you don't have enough capacity for a growing population, or is a need such as what Senator Sullivan brought, or what somebody in a more rural state might have with aging infrastructure? And I think Ms. Dreyfus-Wells, you addressed some of that in some of your testimony. So I guess maybe I'll start with Mr. Ramseur to say, what is the definition of need? Is it aging? Is it leaking? Is it not enough capacity? Wouldn't we be well served? I mean, maybe you can't weigh in on this, but I think we would be well served to make sure definitionally, if we're going to look at this, what does need mean? So is there a definition for need in this statute, or even in the Safe Drinking one?
I'd have to circle back on the Safe Drinking Water Act precise definition, but under the Clean Water Act, the needs surveys that have been published, every 4 years or so from EPA, they have multiple categories of needs, including stormwater, the big ones, wastewater treatment, but to some degree, those categories have changed over the years. So if Congress were to look at updating the formula based on needs, this would be a central question: what is needs, and how wide should the scope of needs be?
Mr. Sigmund, do you have a comment on that? Am I barking up the right tree here?
Oh, need needs to be very broad. All the things you've talked about, you said, is it this or this or this? Yes, it's all of them.
It's all the above.
In addition to aging infrastructure that needs to be refreshed periodically in order to meet the needs, you have, again, growth, the ability to handle growth, whether it's population or other growth, as well as to be able to deal with pending or current regulatory changes. So need is very, very broad, and we need to consider that, be wide in our consideration.
Ms. Dreyfus-Wells, do you have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I think one way to think about need is that our job as wastewater and stormwater managers is to support the land use of our communities. And so that gives a very broad, as Tom said, definition of need. So we have aging infrastructure that has to be replaced. And I would look to local governments, to mayors, to hear about this need as well. I'll just throw out the example of the city of Maple Heights in Northeast Ohio. Common trench sewers, 80 years old, failing, cracking, basement flooding, these types of issues. So that is a need that is unique to Northeast Ohio, but goes to this issue of aging. So we as wastewater managers, we support land use, and so that spreads that need across many categories.
Ms. Watson?
Yes, thank you, Senator. I agree with everything that's been said. I'll just add a little bit of a different flavor. There's, on the one hand, the definition of need, then there's also the ability to demonstrate need. And I think that is another issue that we run into with smaller communities, with rural communities, with disadvantaged communities. It is quite onerous to put together a capital improvement plan to actually demonstrate need. And so technical assistance resources to those communities would go a long way.
And I think that's a repeating theme I think we've heard as well. And we know our cities and communities and counties under the COVID relief were given dollars, and one of the qualifying areas was water and wastewater infrastructure. And, you know, I know from my mayors, they can't figure out how to do this, and then you encourage them to go regionally, and that's not a concept that a lot of mayors really, or county administrators really embrace in our state. Regionally is hard for us, but I think it's probably the more efficient way to go. So let's just say we begin to look at a different way to calculate the formula. If, in fact, we were to do so, it would change from year to year, or I'm getting to the issue of certainty and predictability. I mean, how important is that to you, Ms. Dreyfus-Wells?
It's very important. I think the point of delivering infrastructure efficiently for our customers is having a long-term capital plan. So at the sewer district, we look at these things over a very long time frame, and it involves advanced facilities planning, and then it involves detailed design as you come into actually bidding a project. So that certainty around funding is very important so that you can put together a capital plan that takes advantage of efficiencies from putting together a well-run plan.
Thank you. My last comment will be, if I can, Mr. Chairman, is I see this as this could almost become a cycle. If you're in a declining population area and you aren't able to secure funds to modernize your water and wastewater systems, in my view, that further declines your ability to attract jobs, to attract residents, to attract people into those areas. So if you don't have the ability, because it's only based on population, and certainly this would be environmental justice communities would fall into this category, you're really going to perpetuate that cycle. And on the other hand, if you go to growing population areas and way increase the amount of money for those, then you're going to keep creating more population, and you're going to be getting more and more dollars to be able to modernize. So I think we have to be very careful here, particularly as we're looking at declining populations and rural populations, that we're not feeding into a phenomenon that a lot of these populations are trying to fight right now. So I thank you all for your testimony. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Senator Capito. We have a couple of colleagues that are trying to join us here before we close out. One is Senator Duckworth, and the other is Senator Padilla. Senator Duckworth, have you joined us? I think he's trying to join us by WebEx. Are you out there? All right, all right. Senator Padilla, are you out there?
I sure am. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
You certainly can. Please proceed, Alex.
All right, thank you so much. And I know others have touched on the state revolving fund, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, but wanted to ask a more specific question, and surprise, surprise, be a little California-centric here. California's wastewater systems serve a population of 40 million, living in over 13 million homes across California, and treat 4 billion gallons of sewage per day. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a critical funding mechanism for managing the more than 100,000 miles of sewer collection and 900 wastewater treatment plants throughout my home state. But a lot has changed in California since 1987, when the allotment formula was first implemented. California's population has grown from about 29 million in 1990 to 40 million today. Not only that, but Californians are also on the front lines of the climate crisis, facing both a historic mega drought that is threatening our water supplies, as well as rising sea levels that threaten several sewer systems in a particular region of the state. In its 2016 report, the EPA found that most states do not currently receive appropriated funds in proportion to their reported water quality needs or population, which demonstrates the inadequacy of the current allotment. That's a direct quote from the EPA's 2016 report. The study found that revising the allocation formula would mean California's clean water needs could be more fairly addressed. In fact, the study estimated that such a revision would result in an increase of between 14 and 24% in the state's funding allocation, depending on the criteria used. Mr. Ramseur, how can we ensure that any updated allocation formula best reflects disadvantaged community needs, water quality improvements, and population criteria?
Well, if you were to adjust the formula, you would want to have it follow the most recent needs survey published by EPA. And if you wanted to include certain needs within that scope, you would need to make that clear in the provisions of the Clean Water Act that you're amending.
All right, well, appreciate that answer. Look forward to working with you to accomplish just that. And I'm sure California is not the only state in a situation with significantly different circumstances than when the current formulas were established. I do have a follow-up question as it pertains to water affordability. Water systems across the country are increasing their rates to help fund necessary drinking water and wastewater infrastructure repairs and upgrades. And this, obviously, the need goes far beyond the amount that's been approved in the bipartisan infrastructure law and what may be envisioned in further infrastructure investments. But at the same time, households across the country are facing $1 million of water debt. So, Mr. Ramseur, how would you recommend that we account for affordability in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund formula?
When you're thinking about the scope of needs, assuming you are using needs as the key factor or one of the key factors in a revised formula, you could adjust the definition of needs to include those types of factors. Currently, the states have the ability and the authority to provide funding through the SRF programs for these types of objectives, up to 30% in general from their annual allotment, and they are required, as of recent enactment of the Investment in Jobs Act, to provide 10% of their annual allotment for this purpose.
So, okay. Well, again, I think that's a good start, but certainly look forward to following up with you on these items and working to update the criteria and the formulas to best suit not just California's needs, but every state's needs in this modern era. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Has Senator Duckworth joined us? No. Okay. With that, they're waiting for me another hearing to come and ask some questions. So I'm going to slip out, and we're going to wrap it up here. I got several more questions I want to ask for the record. A quick story. When Winston Churchill was bounced out of office as Prime Minister of England right after World War II, after leading his country valiantly to a victory, he was leaving 10 Downing Street, and he was asked by a reporter, Mr. Churchill, is this the end? And he said, this is not the end. This is not the beginning of the end. This is the end of the beginning. And today's hearing is really the end of the beginning. And no, it's not. It is the end of the beginning. And but we appreciate your helping us kick this off. And we will not see a rush to judgment. We'll be getting Senator Kelly. I'm going to yield to you. You can close it up, but I need to roll. No, hold on. But I think the folks who are on this committee, including the staff that are on this committee, can be proud of the historic drinking water and wastewater investments that we delivered as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law last year. And as we look to the future, we look forward to continuing our conversation with you and others as smart as you, if they're out there. And we'll look forward to continuing our conversation with members of this committee and our staffs. And other stakeholders in order to improve the way we invest in a nation's water infrastructure. A little bit of housekeeping before I yield to Senator Kelly. And I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that include letters from stakeholders and other materials that relate to today's hearing. Additionally, senators will be allowed to submit questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, March 30th. We'll compile those questions, send them to our witnesses, who we'll ask to reply by April 13th. And with that, I yield to Senator Kelly to close it out. And again, our thanks to each and every one of you. Some of you have come a long way, and some of you came a very short way. But in both instances, we're grateful very much, and some of you came from Ohio.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Capito, again for having this hearing. I've got a couple questions I want to submit for the record to Ms. Wells and Ms. Watson, another for Mr. Ramseur. But I do have one question I want to really just quickly follow up on specific. It's about needs again. You know, we've got this historic drought in Arizona, and this question's for Mr. Ramseur. It's, we're trying to capture and recharge aquifers. We've got, we're treating stormwater and even wastewater and reusing it and turning it into drinking water like we do on the space station. You know, I've experienced this myself at times. It actually works pretty well. When we're looking at needs of a state like Arizona, do you feel that needs evolve, and also if things like groundwater recharge or treatment of stormwater or wastewater should be able to be funded through the Clean Water SRF because these are changing needs?
Well, the needs that have been allowed to be addressed through the Clean Water SRF have evolved over time. The initial list of categories was 3, and in 2014, Congress amended that list of eligible category types, and now it's up to 13 or 14. So over time, Congress has recognized that the needs have changed throughout the states and providing more flexibility to the states to address their specific needs.
Well, thank you. And again, Senator Capito, thank you for holding this hearing. And thanks again for everybody being here. And I do have some questions for the record.
Thank you. Thanks to the witnesses, safe travels, and I appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.